Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast, and this is actually our 20th episode, which is so cool to me, but I just wanted to say thank you all for everyone who's been listening and interacting with me on Instagram. I have so much fun talking to you all about the different books and covers, and it's so fun to connect with other people that love Nancy Drew as much as I do. Now, today we're going to be talking about the mystery of the brass-bound trunk. That's a bit of a tongue twister, but that is the 17th book in the Nancy Drew series, and you may hear some rain in the background. It's kind of a rainy, overcast night as I'm recording this, but honestly, I can't think of a better time to discuss a mystery. So, as always, I love to discuss the different covers for the books, and this book actually has 3 separate covers. And if you ever want to look at these before the podcast episode airs on Thursdays, I like to post these on our Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. So, The Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk was first published in 1940, and on this first edition of the book covers, we have Nancy and George, and they're dressed super nice to be going on a boat trip. Like, I think now, like, people, when they go on cruises, at least me, I would dress super comfortably. I'd be wearing, like, flip-flops, t-shirt, you know, but they're, like, dressed in these little cute suit jackets and matching skirts, and you can kind of see a funnel behind Nancy's head and what looks like some men kind of wrestling with some luggage on the dock, and it's a trunk that's kind of falling out of the air at them. It's a really colorful and dynamic cover. There's a lot going on, and the second edition of this book cover shows Nancy with Bess and George, and it looks a little more sinister, like Nancy's kind of looking like out of the corner of her eye, and these guys have this trunk hoisted up in a net, and it's, of course, you know, the brass-bound trunk. And then the third and final edition of this cover, this is the one that I was talking about a few episodes ago that people have spoofed, and they've made their own, you know, title for it, and it's The Mystery of What's She Gonna Do with All That Junk in That Trunk. It was this book, and Nancy, it's again Nancy's floating head, and then we have the silhouette of a ship behind her and all these floating jewels that are kind of coming up out of this trunk. So it's very mysterious looking. So I did come up with a funny cover spoof of my own for these covers, and I said, "Girls, that's what a man with baggage looks like." Because it looks kind of funny. They're all looking on as these guys are struggling to get this trunk on board the ship, and this trunk is pretty much the center of this mystery. So as far as rating these book covers goes, I actually gave these all a 5 magnifying glass rating because they're very interesting to look at, and I always liked them as a kid. They're just really cool, and I know some of the covers kind of fall flat for me, but I really like these. So as far as the characters go in this book, we of course have Bess and George assisting Nancy on this mystery, and I believe they're coming back from the Netherlands on this trip. But they have a roommate named Nelda Detweiler, who conveniently has the same initials as Nancy Drew, and Heinrich, which is their cabin steward, Rodman Havelock, who is their purser, Lou, who is just the locksmith, and Otto August, and of course the captain. So there's a lot of different characters on board the ship. I just looked at my synopsis. It's Holland. They're coming from Holland. But before I jump into the synopsis, you might remember from the previous episode, The Clue of the Tapping Heels, there was this interesting scene at the end of the book where Nancy tap dances in the middle of her recital, and she's just like, "Hey, if anybody has a mystery, you know, let me know." And this guy stands up and says, "Oh, I have a mystery. It's the mystery of the brass-bound trunk." Well, they don't tie this in at all for this book. It's just like, I kept waiting for it, but it's just Nancy, Bess, and George on this little boat trip, and then they stumble into a mystery, so there's no tie-in whatsoever. Also, I just want to preface this by saying Nancy has had so many boat mishaps and accidents, and here she is getting on an ocean liner And nothing about this sounds like a good idea. And you'll see there's quite a few things that happen. And I just don't think she should go on boats anymore. It's just a bad idea. So without further ado, here is my synopsis. Nancy, Bess, and George are sailing from Holland to New York when Nancy sees a man spelling her name in sign language on the dock. Puzzled, Nancy goes to their room only to see a trunk with ND initials that's not hers or her roommate Nelda Detweiler's, and overhears an angry commotion in the hall about a missing trunk. But when she goes to clear up the mix-up, no one is there. Nancy's own trunk is missing, and then a meteor lands in the ocean, narrowly missing the ship. Later, Nancy and George go to identify Nancy's trunk, and luggage falls from the hold, knocking George unconscious. She has to go to the infirmary, and when Nancy returns to their cabin, Bess and Nelda say 2 men pretending to be plumbers tried to steal the ND trunk. Nancy knows there's something valuable in the trunk and discovers a false bottom, which the locksmith helps her open, and inside there are smuggled jewels. Several more crazy things happen, including Nancy and Nelda getting thrown overboard before Nancy is able to implicate Otto August in the jewel smuggling and clear Nelda's name. So yeah, there are a lot of things going on this boat. And naturally, Nancy can't take a vacation without finding another mystery. So for the newspaper headline synopsis, which is just basically a sweeter, shorter version of the main synopsis, I came up with Teen Detective Busts International Jewel Smuggling Ring. So basically, for the entirety of this boat trip, Nancy is trying to figure out where these jewels came from, what kind of smugglers she's dealing with, and she's trying to help her roommate Nelda Detweiler, who was accused of stealing jewels back in her hometown in Africa. So I took down some direct quotes and notes from this book because there were quite a few interesting things that happened in this book. So the first thing that I wrote down is Nancy sees someone signing and spelling her name on the dock, and she calls it finger language, which I thought was weird. And then she almost falls overboard, and luckily Bess is there to pull her back. But I looked this up. Apparently that was another name for sign language, but I thought that was so weird to call it finger language. So my next note just says, Nancy again describes Nelda Detweiler as a strange girl. And I said, not everyone is strange and you're normal, Nancy. Like, seriously, because you solve all these mysteries for no compensation whatsoever. I mean, she called someone else weird, Laura Pendleton, in the Bungalow Mystery. She is in this habit of describing other people as strange, and I find that funny coming from her. It could be more of a Mildred Wirt Benson and Harriet Stratmeyer thing. Like, strange could mean interesting in this context, but in the modern day, it's kind of lost, and it just sounds like you're calling someone weird. So this next note kind of gave me a dose of the ick, because Nancy admits that she thinks Rodman Havelock is cute. He is one of the guys who works on the ship, and he's 30. He's 30. Nancy is 18. I said, this is scandalous. She does say he's probably married with half a dozen children, though, like, as if that makes it better. I was just like, no. Like, Nancy, you should stick to people your own age. I thought this was so weird. And this is in the revised edition, so I'm like, was this played up more in the original text? I don't know, because I need to get my hands on some of the originals. But, yeah, I don't know. I didn't like that. Now, my next note has to do with the fact that a meteor almost hit the ship. Like, as if Nancy can't have enough disasters just with boats sinking and canoes hitting submarines and all these things happening. A meteor from the sky almost hits the ship. It's like, okay, this is a message from the cosmos. Nancy, you do not need to get on boats anymore. It's funny, too, because, of course, this comes at the end of a chapter, and it kind of is a cliffhanger. And then it just says there's a huge wave, and it washes up over the deck, and people are screaming. And, of course, there's obviously chaos, because, I mean, if I was on a cruise with Royal Caribbean, and then I see this meteor come out of the sky, I would be freaking out. If I wasn't, like, at the buffet or sleeping or something, if I was up on deck and that happened, I would be so terrified. I mean, it's not every day that you see this huge space rock fly out of the sky and come hurtling towards you. And it's funny because, you know, the next day they just kind of brush it off. And they're like, okay, cool, we survived. It's fine. You know, let's go back to solving this mystery. So yeah, if that's not a sign that Nancy needs to stay off boats, I don't know what is. So my next note just says Nancy and George go to identify her trunk and luggage from the hold falls on them. And Nancy is so afraid that George is dead that she actually faints. And I mean, George got clobbered in the head because apparently like a meteor almost hitting the ship isn't enough. They hit some big waves on the sea, and I guess that's why all this luggage falls down. So George has to go to the infirmary, and Nancy wakes up in the infirmary, and later her and Rod go back to get her trunk at 2:30 in the morning because they don't want people to see them with the trunk. They're trying to confuse the people who are trying to get the other trunk. It's a whole thing. But they find a dead rat wedged between Nancy's trunk and another one, and I just put yuck. My next note said there's a weird swimming race, because there's a pool on this boat, with some people named Al, Bruce, Chipper, and Tubby. And I said, ugh. So apparently these people are supposed to be kind of like Nancy, Bess, and George. Like Tubby is the equivalent of Bess, I guess. But they're so weird. They act like Nancy has been avoiding them, and it's like, no, you all are complete strangers. Like it would be weird to talk to you guys. But then they say winner gets a kiss, and I was just like, okay, I'm out. So my next note says George wins this masquerade costume contest on the ship by wearing an old nightgown she's sewn mice onto, and she's carrying a lit candle. And I said, after all the disasters on this ship, I don't think I'd be carrying an open flame. But George does win, and she gets some perfume. But still, I was just like, y'all are tempting fate here. The next thing that I wrote down is Rod, quote-unquote, claims Nancy for a dance, which I guess is pretty typical word usage for the time. But I said, he's 30. He's 30. I still just couldn't get over that. I was like, this age gap is gapping. Also, this next thing is so not cool. But at the dance, the guys start fat-shaming Tubby. And I was like, why? Why do we got to do this to people? We do this to Bess. We do this to Tubby. Like, his name is Tubby. What is his real name? I want to know his real name. Is it Ken? Is it... I don't know. It's just not... I hate how they do this in these books. Now, one of the cool things in this book was that Nancy uses her magnifying glass and flashlight, both of these, in this mystery. So she's used a bobby pin up to this point, and now we see the magnifying glass come out. So that was pretty cool. And my final note is the girls brought their own ping pong paddles. They're serious. So they play ping pong to pass the time on the ship when they're not racing in the pool or trying to solve this mystery. But I was like, who brings their own ping pong paddles? That's intense. I mean, that kind of just seems like a wasted space in your luggage, but I don't know. Maybe they could just double as weapons. I don't know. Now, I usually like to do a section on the podcast called What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, but obviously she didn't make it for this trip. She's back in River Heights, I guess, doing her regular housekeeping duties. So instead, I've got some skills that Nancy could add to her resume. So I said expert ping pong paddler because... you know, who brings their own ping pong paddles, and champion diver, because at one point Nancy dives into the ocean, I think to save Nelda, and clue obtainer, because Nancy's using the magnifying glass, using the flashlight, and she's using a lot of the skills that we see her develop later on in some of the later books. So there were some things that I liked about this book and some things that I didn't like, so let's jump right into them. So for the things that I liked, I said I liked the boat setting at first, because at first it's very neat and it's different. You know, Nancy's never been on a big, Atlantic cruise like this. But then, I don't know, like towards the end of the book, it started to feel really limiting. Kind of like when you play those Nancy Drew games and you can only go to like one location. It's just kind of boring. So I liked it at first, and then I started to not like it, if that makes sense. I also put down that I loved Nancy's intensive clue finding and determination to solve this mystery, because she went back to that brass-bound trunk I don't know how many times, 3-4 times, and she kept finding jewelry in different places. And she was very intent on figuring out the sign language messages that these people were sending back and forth on the deck. And yeah, she did quite a bit to solve this mystery. Now on to the things that I didn't like. So yeah, you probably knew this one was coming, but I said Rod was old. And I don't know, like nothing really happened, but Rod would like blush at something that Nancy said, or it was just implied. And I was just like, no. I also, like I mentioned before, I said the boat started to feel a little bit limiting after a while. And the next thing I said was, how many times we got to check out this trunk? Like, Nancy kept going back to it and kept going back to it. And she would find a necklace, and then she'd find a bracelet, and then find some earrings. And I was like, what is going on? I mean, it's a huge trunk, but it just felt a little bit repetitive. So when it comes to my magnifying glass rating for this book, I decided to give The Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk 2 magnifying glasses because it did feel a bit repetitive in places. I mean, the mystery made sense, but it just wasn't my favorite. I will say the meteor, that really completely took me by surprise, but the rest of it, it wasn't my favorite. So that concludes this episode for The Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk, and on next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion. So if you like circus animals and explosive oranges and plots against NASA Space Center, then you won't want to miss this episode. And in the meantime, until next Thursday, if you want to tide yourself over with some funny Nancy Drew related content, you can follow my Instagram at True Drew Podcast. And if you want to leave this podcast a review, wherever you're listening, if it's Apple or Spotify, wherever, I would really appreciate it. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.